Good morning. Today we will speak about Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He was the son of a Viscount de Saint-Exupéry. So that was not his last name, that was his title. But of course he has been known to posterity by his title for being son of the Viscount de Saint-Exupéry. He was the third of 5 children, and he had a very happy childhood. And remembering his childhood, in particular Christmas, he says, "When I was a little boy, the lights of the Christmas tree, the music of the midnight mass, the tenderness of smiling faces used to make up so the radiance of the gifts I received." So he had a very happy childhood, and I don't know why this is often understated in his biographies, but who was the little prince? He himself. That's how his mother used to call him. His mother used to call him my little prince, mon petit prince. And that is often understated. Of course, there are other characters that could be, other real-life characters who could be also a source of inspiration for the little prince, but the very word, the very phrase, my little prince, mon petit prince, is the way his mother used to address him. And when he was 4, his father, the Viscount, died, and this only tightened even more the bond between him and his mother, and they corresponded for the rest of Antoine's life. In 1912, it's easy to follow the biography of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry because he was born with a century, 1900. So when he was 12, in 1912, he applied for the Navy and Aviation School, but he was turned down. He was rejected, yes. And instead, he joined the Faculty of Arts in a Catholic institute. He, of course, mocked his own artistic talents, but fortunately for his longings and his aspirations, the outbreak of World War I created a need for pilots, and then he was admitted to the aviation school. It was then when he learned how to fly. And by the way, he also used to read and sometimes even to write while he was flying. Yes. He would never take off without a notebook to write his philosophical thoughts. And once, don't think he did this every time, but at least once, he was about to land, but he decided to just continue flying a little more to finish the final chapter of the novel he was reading. Yes, question.
I don't know what year he entered this.
During World War I. So it must have been toward the end of the war, maybe 1918, around that time. I'm not entirely sure when he joined the military academy and he learned how to fly. In 1926, he published his first novel, 1926, whose title was The Aviator. And eventually, in 1928, he would publish Southern Mail, his second novel. Why Southern Mail? Well, because he was already working in South America, and he was promoted to in 1929. He was promoted to be the general director of the Latin American Post, stationed in Buenos Aires, Argentina. This inspired Night Flight, vol de nuit in French. Night Flight. Back then, the mail was the mail was effective with railroads, and that was good enough for the needs of the time. So if airmail wanted to have an edge, they had to offer something else. And they had the possibility to fly during the night, which was not possible for the land mail. And that's what gave them an advantage. So it was a very difficult start for the airmail, and he was one of the pioneers in the airmail, which often constrained him to fly during the night. In 1931, his company faced bankruptcy, and he had various adventures. One of the most critical ones was a crash in the Sahara Desert. He was not alone. He was with André Prévost. He was his mechanical and co-pilot. They crashed in the Sahara Desert, and they had supplies only for one day. The second day, they started hallucinating and seeing mirages, and they were completely dehydrated. And on the fourth day, a Bedouin rescued them. This would inspire his novel, Terre d'Hommes. In Spanish it would be Tierra de Hombres, which in English it's Wind, Sun, and Stars. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because he would write that much later on. His experience in the desert. When he remembers the Bedouin who saved him and his co-pilot, he underwent some kind of treatment to be rehydrated. And he says about this incident, "You Bedouin of Libya who saved our lives, though you will dwell forever in my memory, yet I shall never be able to recapture your features. You are humanity, and your face comes into my mind simply as a man incarnate. You, our beloved fellow man, did not know who we might be, and yet you recognized us without fail, and I, in my turn, shall recognize you in the faces of all mankind. You came toward me in an aureole of charity and magnanimity, bearing the gift of water. All my friends and all my enemies marched toward me in your person. It did not seem to me that you were rescuing me. Rather, did it seem that you were forgiving me, and I felt I had no enemy left in the world." It's profound, I think. After he recovered from the injuries of this accident, he undertook some other roles. For example, flying over Spain during the Civil War, covering what was going on or following up with the most recent events in Moscow. So they were mostly journalistic trips that he undertook by plane. And in 1939, he suffered another accident in Guatemala. 1939. He was recovering in New York. And it is then when he wrote Wind, Sun, and Stars. Of course, you know that World War II was just about to start, and you also know that in World War II, although we say that it was France and England against Germany and Russia, well, we know that there was a point when it was England all alone, because France capitulated very soon, very early during the war, and this was the Vichy regime, and occupied France constrained him and his wife, of whom I will speak later on, Consuelo Sunsin, to leave France. They came to America, and they spent 27 months in America. It catches my attention to realize the luxury they lived in, because they had a penthouse in Central Park. And mid-1900s, I don't think it was much different from our days. And eventually they would have a mansion, a bean house mansion in Long Island, where he used to see the sunset. So I think he was not facing any kind of financial difficulties. He spent 27 months in America, and those were also very fruitful months. Maybe more than half of his writings those that have been preserved, those that have survived and have been published, were written in America. One of them was the novel War Pilot, and of course, the most famous short story or novel he wrote, The Little Prince. That was also written in America, in New York. In 1943, he joined the French resistance in northern Africa, and he undertook some recognition flights, especially in Corsica and Sardinia. And on the 31st of July, 1944, he disappeared in the Mediterranean. So that's the end of Saint-Exupéry. Just for your culture and information, in 2004, his aircraft was retrieved. And they also found the bracelet with his name, and some thought it was a fake, but eventually it was clarified that this was actually his flight, his plane, and that and if I'm not mistaken, the German pilot who took down his flight was still alive, and he felt sorry that it had been he who had taken down Saint-Exupéry's plane. He left an unfinished novel, The Citadel, which was published posthumously in 1948. I left unnamed his wife, Consuelo Sunsin, a Salvatorian writer, once widowed, once divorced, and they had a troubled marriage. She is the main inspiration for the rose in The Little Prince. So you can think about the difficulties and the disagreements he had with the rose, and when he encounters 500 roses in a garden, roses that no one has domesticated, those are symbols of his affairs. Nevertheless, he comes always back to his rose. Maybe the most famous of these affairs was the one he had with his assistant, Hélène de Vogue, who died in 2003, and she also wrote a biography of Saint-Exupéry. So you can see things from her perspective, and Consuelo Sunsin also wrote Memoirs of the Rose. So it is her perspective of her life with Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. What to say about The Little Prince? Who was the source of inspiration? It could have been he himself, or it could have been a child he met in Quebec with whom he was particularly impressed. The manuscript consisted of 140 pages. In the manuscript, although now it's deteriorating, but you can still see the manuscript. Not everyone can, but it's still preserved. And in it, you can see that there are cigarette stains and coffee stains. And something that catches my attention is that the phrase "l'essentiel est invisible pour les yeux," the essential is invisible for the eyes, he penned it 15 times, trying to come with the perfect phrasing until he was satisfied with the way this phrase was going to crystallize better. He wrote it 15 times. Of course, this is one of the most famous quotes of The Little Prince. However, I prefer to look for the hidden details and the hidden gems in the Little Prince. For example, in chapter 18, when the Little Prince crosses the desert and he encounters a flower with only 3 petals. And "Good morning," said the Little Prince. "Good morning," said the flower. "Where are the men? Where are the men?" The Little Prince asked. The flower had seen a caravan, and she said, "I think there are 6 or 7. So when you think about it, and I don't know if you can see it, men are scarce. But let's continue. You never know where to find them. They drift with the wind. They have no roots. That makes it very difficult. So, while it may be read as a naive perception from the flower's perspective, I think it can speak very eloquently about human nature and how men have no roots, how they drift with the wind, and how they are difficult to find. Then he climbs a mountain, and let me see. I just want to make sure I find the right chapter. Oh, it's before this. Okay, yes. He climbs a mountain, and do you remember the conversation he has with the echo? He says, hello, and the echo responds, hello, hello, hello. The echo responded. Who are you? The little prince asks. Who are you? Who are you? Who are you? The echo responded. Be my friends. I am alone. I am alone. I am alone. I am alone. The echo responded. And the little prince says, what a weird planet. Everything is dry. Everything is pointy. And men lack imagination. They only repeat what you tell them. Doesn't that speak about eloquently about human nature? So again, it could be a naive remark or a childish remark of the little prince who doesn't know how the echo works. But men lack imagination. They only repeat what you tell them. So I like to find those hidden passages that maybe are not so memorable or so quotable or so memeable, but nevertheless, I think those are very profound insights into human nature. I said that the original manuscript consisted of 140 pages. However, for the final edition, Saint-Exupéry pruned, cropped, and trimmed, and he left out some chapters. For example, there's a chapter with an ambassador. There are chapters dedicated to explaining the way and the lifestyle the little prince lived in his planet. Those were removed from the final edition, and especially Saint-Exupéry removed explanatory passages. Why? Because he wanted to leave it open to interpretation. And I think that was a very good move, because he shortened it a lot and he left it very open to interpretations. And I'm going to dedicate a few minutes to speaking about the interpretations of the Little Prince. As you can imagine, during the Vichy regime, when France was occupied, the Little Prince was banned. However, it circulated in the underground. When Saint-Exupéry joined the forces in Northern Africa, he took a copy of The Little Prince with himself. Is it a book for children?
Yes.
It is. Is it a book for adults?
Yes.
Why? Because it can be read in various layers. It has various layers, and that accounts for its richness. It can be read on various levels. It has multiple layers. And it's worth noting that The Little Prince has been translated to over 300 languages. It's one of the most translated works. And it's also interesting to see how it connects with very different cultures. Some of these languages to which it has been translated are very remote dialects. Nevertheless, those tribal cultures or those native cultures can understand and associate and find some resonance in the Little Prince as well. Or cultures that might seem too foreign to us, like China. Just in Chinese, there are over 70 translations. So it catches my attention how well adapted it is. Of course, it has also seen adaptations to the cinema, to recording, to ballet, to opera, video games, expositions, museums, thematic parks, sculptures, paintings. So it has inspired a lot. Not to name all the streets and the airport in Lyon, that is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. What else? And so many schools called The Little Prince. Before I prepared this particular lecture, because it's not the first time I lecture on Saint-Exupéry, I would have presented Antoine de Saint-Exupéry like some kind of existentialist, and with who holds an immanentistic philosophy, because he highlights great values like friendship, the use of time, the value of love, the value of contemplating, and all those things. But does he point towards some transcendent realm, or is all that immanentistic? If you had asked me 1 year ago, I would have said it's completely immanentistic. But as I was preparing this lecture, I started delving a little more into his Catholicism. And the question is, when you read Tolkien, is that a Catholic book, or is it a great book written by a Catholic? And Tolkien, I think he says it explicitly, he removes all references to priests in the Lord of the Rings, to rituals, to any kind of religion, because he is presenting this as an allegory of the entirety of spiritual life. Coming back now to The Little Prince, the question is this an immanentistic piece of literature, or are those references to transcendence removed precisely to point toward that direction? I think this is an important question, and something that cannot be understated is his Catholic upbringing. Regardless of how tumultuous his life was, his upbringing was that of a Catholic. He joined a Catholic institute, and to begin with, sorry, I have a quote here. Yes. There's definitely the wonder of amazement. If you don't become like little children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Aristotle says that amazement is the beginning of philosophy. He tries to awaken in us that inner child. What happens to children as they mature into adults? You have chosen not to be perturbed by great problems, having trouble enough to forget your own fate as man. You are not the dweller upon an errant planet, and do not ask yourself questions to which there are no answers. You are a petit bourgeois of Toulouse. Nobody grasped you by the shoulder while there was still time. Now the clay of which you were shaped has dried and hardened, and not in you will ever awaken the sleeping musician, the poet, the astronomer that possibly inhabited in you in the beginning. The squall has ceased to be a cause of my complaint. The magic of the craft has opened for me a world in which I shall confront within 2 hours the black dragons and the crowned crests of a coma of blue lightnings. And when night has fallen, I delivered shall read my course into the stars. I don't know if Einstein really said this, because there are many quotes attributed to him, but he is credited with saying, "I don't have any particular talent. I am just passionately curious." Whether he said it or not, let's focus on the fact and the truth of this statement. Einstein, in an autobiographical way, recalls his childhood, and you know that they regarded him as a retarded, as a child. And he says, since I developed later in life, I started asking myself the questions most children ask at an early age, but I asked those questions at a much later age. And at that point, I was not satisfied with the cut and dry responses that adults gave to me. That is what prompted his quest. Let's go back now to The Little Prince. In The Little Prince, we find that quest. We find that unceasing search, and he never tires to ask questions. He asks questions and he never retreats his question until it has been answered, with the exception of what's the second planet? The vain man. He asks a question, the vain man doesn't answer because they only listen to flattery, and he leaves. That's the exception, okay? But every time he poses a question, he never ceases in his quest. So that is important because it reveals a lot about the inner child that Saint-Exupéry is trying to awaken in us. In addition, there's a great influence in Saint-Exupéry of maybe the only Catholic modern philosopher. There might be a few more, but whom am I thinking of? A great philosopher and a scientist in the modern ages, in the 1600s. 1600s, yes.
Pascal?
Exactly. Blaise Pascal. Blaise Pascal. While rationalism of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz was battling against empiricism of Bacon, Locke, and Hume, there's another way of access, that of intuition. And remember that Pascal didn't construct a complete system. He just has scattered thoughts. He didn't have enough time and enough lifespan to complete his works. But one of his sayings is, maybe the most famous saying of Pascal is, the heart has reasons that reason cannot understand. Doesn't that find some resonance in the essential is invisible to the eyes? One only sees well with the heart. So the influence of Pascal, I think, has to be stressed when we approach Saint-Exupéry. The power of intuition, the power of wonder. And finally, I mentioned some candidates that could be the source of inspiration for The Little Prince. But what if it's Christ himself? Someone who comes down to earth, who dies beaten by the snake, the symbol of sin, and who ascends back into heaven, body and soul. So I think this opens a new window for our reading of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.